to After Alexander, Episode 6, The House of Argos. First off, I'm going to have to announce that there's unfortunately been a bit of a change of plan. My idea initially was to go back through the mythical founding of the dynasty to which Alexander belonged, as well as what we know happened historically. However, I've realised that this would only be tangentially relevant to our story itself, and would simply take time away from releasing more relevant content. So I've shelved that idea for now. I might potentially come back to it at a date when I have more time to do it justice, but for now I'm going to stick with the immediate descendants of Philip II, as they're the only ones of relevance for our purposes. All I will say is that the Encyclopaedia Britannica tells me the myth connecting them back to Heracles supposedly starts with Alexander I of Macedon, who reigned in the mid-400s BC or so, in an attempt to win over Greek sympathies. Bearing that in mind, we're going to focus on what's been going on with the royal family Alexander the Great was a part of. Specifically, we'll be focusing on what's happened since his death in 323 BCE and have a quick summary. The endpoint for our discussion will have to jump ahead a bit of where we are now, as although the Argeads aren't long for this world, they're going to be around for a little while longer yet. So, the House of Argos then. As I covered in previous episodes, Philip II usurped the crown from his brother's branch of the family. However, we didn't really explore that topic in enough detail, so let's go through that now. The old king and Philip's father, Amyntas III, had three sons, Alexander, Perdiccas, and Philip. Alexander II took the throne when his father died, but swiftly passed the baton on to his brother when he died young, who then became Perdiccas III. Perdiccas III then kept the tradition going somewhat by also dying, and leaving an infant son as king in the form of Amyntas IV. During the reigns of these two kings, Macedon had been slowly eroding apparently as a leading power. Philip II assumed the title of regent, but, as you would expect from the fact that he has a number after his name, usurped the throne for himself in 359 BCE. As we discussed, it was this precedent that would have hovered in the minds of the successors with Perdiccas when he seemed to move ever closer to the kingship after Alexander died. However, it's the children of Philip II we're really interested in, as they're the generation that are still alive at the time of the struggle between Alexander's generals. I'm just going to focus on the children and not on the various marriages of Philip and half-siblings or not, as that's probably going to end up obscuring the story. Firstly, and most obviously, there's Alexander himself and his full sister Cleopatra, and their half-brother Philip III. But there are others that we haven't really mentioned yet. At this point, I'm unfortunately going to have to ask you to get your metaphorical salt shakers out, as you're going to need to take the following list and description with a pinch of salt, a precaution if you like. The only place I've been able to find an exhaustive list so far is on Wikipedia. This doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong, but it's worth mentioning. I'm unfortunately going to have to take it and other websites at their word for now, as I don't really have the time or resources to do anything other than a quick overview. So with that in mind, let's get going. First of all, there's Sinani. As we mentioned in episode 1, her daughter Eurydice was married to Philip III. However, I didn't really touch on the father at the time, because it wasn't relevant to our story. In fact, Sinani's husband and Eurydice's father was the disinherited Amyntas IV, the nephew of Philip II we mentioned a moment ago. She was murdered in 322 BCE at the hands of Alcitas, although we're not entirely sure why. Sinani's daughter, Eurydice, is by the time of the finishing of our narrative last episode also dead, having been murdered by Olympius along with her husband, Philip III. Only two daughters of Philip II and the siblings of Alexander remain alive at the time of the Third War, Thessalonica and Cleopatra. Thessalonica is supposed to have been named in honour of Philip II's victory at Thessaly, which was going on around the time of her birth. If this is true, all I can say is thank goodness naming customs have changed a bit since then, but anyway. Like the rest of the royal family at the time, Thessalonica was under the influence of Cassander. In fact, he decided to marry her after 315 BCE, presumably happy to shoulder the tiresome burden of being directly connected to the family that theoretically ruled the whole empire. How Thessalonica herself felt about all this, of course, I can't say. She would give birth to 3 sons eventually, Philip, Antipater, and Alexander, and become the queen of Cassander's Macedon. Quick side note at this point, it might be worth me calling their empire as a whole Macedonia for now, to avoid confusing it with the smaller Macedon that Cassander ruled and will outlive the empire. As a side note as well, Cassander refounded an old city which he named in her honour, Thessalonica, which is still with us today in Greece. If you needed a trivia fact for a pub quiz or similar, there you go. Finally, let's touch on Cleopatra. As the only full sister of Alexander the Great, you can imagine that the political points she could give to an aspiring general's scorecard were massive. Perdiccas had duly tried to repudiate his engagement to Nicaea, Antipater's daughter if you remember, and marry Cleopatra, although we don't know whether this was on Olympias's initiative or that of Cleopatra herself. After Perdiccas's death and the rise of Antigonus, Cleopatra was placed under house arrest. Given the potential shift in the balance of power her marriage would have represented, it's unlikely anyone at the top of the tree would have been too happy about the prospect of her marrying. She had previously been married in 337 BCE to Alexander I of Epirus, and had borne him 1 son, Neoptolemus II of Epirus. However, he was dead at this point, so any remarriage would have the potential to upset the delicate game the generals were playing, which they would have hated. Cleopatra will accordingly spend 10 years under house arrest, until she eventually tries to escape in 308 BCE. The Livius article I read on her says that Ptolemy was visiting the Aegean Sea at the time, and she tried to escape to join him. However, she will be murdered in 308, and people point the finger of blame to Antigonus. Finally, let's come back to little Alexander IV, the son of Alexander the Great. The treaty back in 311 had explicitly stated that Alexander would rule and gain full power when he came of age. This would have been immediately threatening to Cassander, as he ruled over the old heartland of Macedon and held custody of the king, which basically is a polite way of saying prison in all probability. You can imagine that an of-age Alexander IV was not going to react too kindly to his confinement when time came to exercise power, although obviously I'm just speculating here. So, both Alexander IV and his mother Roxane were eventually assassinated on Cassander's orders in 309 BCE. So, that's our quick summary of the Macedonian royal family. 2 sisters, 1 half and 1 full, of Alexander remained at the end of the Third War, along with Alexander IV. Added to that, there's the blood relations in Macedon and Epirus, the 3 half-nephews and 1 full nephew of Alexander. I should mention for completeness that a man surfaced after his death claiming to be Heracles of Macedon, Alexander the Great's illegitimate son. However, as he's only tangentially relevant and doesn't really get involved in the larger political scene, I'm mostly going to ignore him. So, as always, thanks for listening. For any corrections, comments or questions, head to afteralexpod@gmail.com. That again, afteralexpod@gmail.com. Until next time, have a great week, everyone.